This is a video discussing Flatlock wide, which is used on the Creative Serger, and I know a few of you have had problems with it, and I've been trying to think of the ways we can resolve some of these. Obviously they're probably all different problems, so I thought I'd just do a video going through some of the problems we have with Flatlock. First of all, I threaded up for the 2-thread Flatlock wide, which with my ovation guide is the top right one, and I'm going to have the lower looper threaded and then the needle threaded, just the 2 threads, and I'm going to use the subsidiary looper. So I'm just going to run through that. I've already threaded the machine. So starting with the lower looper, there's really nothing different. I've got the decorative thread on a spool pin, one of these flat ones, and it's going to go up through the lower looper at the top of the extension arm. I just want to say, make sure you have that fully extended up, and then it's going to come down, go through the lower looper, go under this clip here, and then into the lower looper tubes. Now I've got the thread in there using a thread cradle, and the reason I use thread cradles is if I'm forcing the thread through and it breaks, I can pull it out. If I've got the metal piece that comes with, sometimes the metal gets stuck in there, so I nearly always use a thread carrier to thread up heavier threads. And there it is coming through the looper, and I'm just leaving it dangling. There's about 3 inches there, and it's just dangling down. Don't be pulling it up under the foot. So that's the lower looper, same as it always is. So the next thing is the needle thread, and the needle thread, in your instruction book, it tells you to put it on overlock needle 1 and to go up through the extension arm at overlock 1, and then to come down through the upper looper channel. Now you can certainly do that. For me, it works better when I place it actually on the upper looper pin, go up through the upper looper, and then through the upper looper channel and under this clip. And then that it stops there. It's now going to go into the needle. So I've noticed it's jumped out there. I thread it across to the needle, and because I'm using extra thick thread, I use the metal threading loopers, just because it's easier to get the thread through there, and I also use a top stitch needle. In fact, here are the looper threaders. They're the 6 loop needle threaders by Dritz. So I have my needle threaded and my 2 threads all in place, but I still have to make other adjustments. My upper looper has to be up, and then I also have to use my subsidiary looper. See this bit that just flicks back and forth? And if you check the end of the subsidiary looper, you'll find this little point on the end, and that little point has to go into the hole on the upper looper. And the purpose of it is to fool the machine into thinking there is thread in there. Now I'm doing Flatlock wide, so I have my automatic tension dial on A. If I was doing narrow, I'd have it on B. For the purpose of this tote, you're actually working on a fold. So I always recommend using the lace applicator foot. And the reason for that is that it makes sure that your stitch is the same width all the way down the fold, because you use this section as a guide. And this section moves back and forth. You've got a screw to tighten it. So I move it in slightly. In fact, it's in this metal bit here is just in the same place as needle 2 would be. And the reason for that is with Flatlock, it's actually better to sew slightly off the fabric. So some of the stitch is going to be off the fabric, so that when we go to straighten it, there's going to be more wiggle room for it to lay flat. Of course, you can do it without, you just have to make sure you keep it straight. The reason I'm not using a knife is because we're working on a fold. My stitch length is on 3, and my stitch width is on 7.5. And as I say, I have my knife locked down. Right, I'm going to start my thread going, and what I'm going to do is hold my thread here when I start, and I'm going to make sure that I have about 3 inches of thread hanging down from the lower looper. Everything else is all set. Got my foot down, and I'm just going to sew, and you can see the stitches starting immediately. And there I have my thread chain. Right, to do the stitching, I want the rungs on the right side because I'm going to put my ribbon and my weaving through here. So you're going to make a fold and you're going to sew with the wrong side up. And here you can see I've sewn this. It's gone through the machine. And here it is when it comes off the machine. Okay. So now we need to pull it flat. So you're just literally going to pull on the stitching. And it's going to flatten out, and that's going to give you the rungs. And on this side you still have a decorative stitch, and you will use that on the Creative Serger tote from this side too. So what problems did I have with thread? Let's discuss the thread. I basically can use any thread, any decorative thread. The only one that gave me trouble was the razzle, and the razzle works fine in the lower looper, but it's a problem in the needle because it's probably a bit thick. So my advice for this project is not to use the razzle in the needle. But all the other threads worked really well. I had no problem with them. The other exception is Fizzle. And the problem with Fizzle is it comes in these big cones. And I do use it regularly to do Flatlock. But the problem is when you stand it on the machine, the thread tends to drop down. And I haven't used a net over it. You could certainly try that. But it is quite a thick thread. And again, I would probably only use that in the lower looper at this stage, unless you're very experienced. The Designer 7 is really a dead easy thread, which behaves really well. And if you're having problems, it might be a good idea to consider using that in both your needle and your upper looper. And the pearl crown works really well. Even though it's a rayon, it's finer than the razzle rayon. So I think that covers the threads. And as I say, I spent all day working on this, and I managed to have some problems, which is good because then I know, or I can at least try and work out what they are. And you can see here, I had trouble here. These rows of stitching were problematic. You can actually see that the thread broke on this one. And I actually use the Eleganza, which is a great thread, and I use that all the time. And I use it in the needle because it's slightly finer again. But in this case, I did use it in the needle, and I used Dazzle in the lower looper. And these shouldn't have been a problem for me because I've used them successfully everywhere else. But the difference when I had the breaking thread was that I actually had the needle thread on overlock needle 1 position and going up through overlock needle 1 on the extension arm. And I think it just adds a little bit more pressure to the needle thread, which is why I prefer to use the upper looper position. And again, the same here, it kind of tightened. So I prefer to use the upper looper spool pin for my needle thread and going up through the upper looper slot on the upper extension arm. And that seemed to solve all my problems. So if you're having trouble with thread, it's worth considering that to avoid the razzle. And perhaps if you've had trouble with it on the overlock needle 1 position, try the upper looper position. So other problems could be the needle not being in securely. It could also be that you have your differential feed on. That will cause you a problem. Make sure it's on normal. Make sure your foot is down at all times. But I'm thinking that another issue might be that people aren't getting their thread chain running before they put their fabric under. So that's another issue. And really, I can't think of much else. So we've covered needle, the differential feed. Obviously, the overlock knob has to be on overlock and not wave. And your automatic tension dial's on A for wide, and it's going to be on B for narrow. But I think that covers all the things I can think of that might cause you aggravation. You know, problems do happen sometimes. It's a question of being patient, working it out. I quite like solving a problem, so it's good for me. But I hope I've come up with something that might help you. And if anybody needs any more help, please email me.